first speaker is Mr. Kyle Varner, MD. Mr. Kyle Varner earned his BA from St. John's College and his MD from American University of Antigua College of Medicine, and completed his residency in internal medicine at Tripler Army Medical Center. He holds a board certification from the American Board of Internal Medicine and practices hospital medicine, Washington State, Alaska, and Maine. A Libertarian Party member since 1999, he has served as a treasurer of the Libertarian Party of Hawaii and currently serves on the board of directors of Liberty International. Welcome.
So, capitalism is a beautiful economic system that's responsible for our quality of life. It's responsible for raising of billions of human beings out of the abject poverty that's the default state of human existence. And it's something that I talk about incessantly. But capitalism is currently under threat. And we've talked already about this threat over and over again at this conference. And I have a unique perspective on why capitalism is under threat. And I think the best way for me to describe it is to use a metaphor of a disease. Capitalism has cancer. And the cancer that is killing the economic system that we rely on for our lives is cartels. So let's talk about what I mean. Left-wing movements are resurgent all around the world. We're all really familiar with the absolute devastation taking place in Venezuela. We're seeing left-wing movements on every corner of the globe. And in the United States, we have politicians like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who are boldly using communist talking points in their campaign rallies, in their campaign literature, and in their campaign rhetoric. In fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is even so shameless as to have hired a group of video producers who call themselves means of production. This is a group of people who take their inspiration from Marx, they use the language of Marx, and they intend to implement Marx's economic ideas in what should be the very heart of capitalism, the United States. And you know, the really scary thing is that they are having a lot of success. You know, Bernie Sanders came very close to being the president of the United States. And this is someone who's attended Sandinistas rallies, who traveled to the Soviet Union and praised them. This is someone who is continually using communist talking points and expressing sympathy for Marxist guerrillas throughout Latin America. This is extremely scary. And so I have a lot of experience talking to people who hold left-wing ideals as something that's a bona fide good. And we've all talked to leftists, whether they are kind of miniature leftists or center leftists, or whether they're radical leftists. And when we talk to them, it sounds and it feels, and I think it's true, that we're talking about a different language. Because I see profit as the increase in happiness generated by an exchange. That is, I understand that every purchase is a sale, and that when I sell something, the buyer profits and I profit, and it's a positive sum game. But there are other people who don't feel that way, and they see profit as the unpaid wages of the working class, the stolen wages of the workers. They see profit as fundamentally exploitative, and I can talk until I am blue in the face to these people and tell them that capitalism is a positive sum game, that a rising tide lifts all ships. I can sell them my vision of prosperity that's like none other that we could even imagine, and yet they don't believe me. And so we yell at each other. And so countries in Latin America have civil wars going 40, 50 years. And so very dangerous politicians get more and more power in the United States, threatening to undermine everything that the American experiment has achieved up until now. Why? Unfortunately, it's because when many people look at the kind of capitalism we practice in the United States, They don't see a positive-sum game. They don't see profit on both sides of the equation when something is bought or sold. What they see is an extractive and exploitative system where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And they're not wrong. They're wrong, but they're not wrong to look at the things they're complaining about and see that. And if we don't start addressing the reason they feel this way, we will never get anywhere, and they will win. And despite the fact that communism has killed over 100 million people in the last 100 years, despite the fact that every single place on earth where leftism or socialism has been implemented, it's resulted in mass death and mass suffering, it will be implemented again in the land of the free. And we cannot let that happen. The stakes are simply too high. So, I said capitalism has cancer. I want to tell you about something in medicine called the two-hit hypothesis. The two-hit hypothesis is the idea that normal cells, healthy cells, require multiple mutations in order to turn into a dangerous cancer cell that can kill you. You have to have a mutation in the cell, in the genes that regulate reproduction, and then another mutation. And what does this mean for this metaphor of capitalism having cancer? It means that there are multiple steps towards the decay of capitalism and ultimately the rise of leftism. So let me, before I talk more in detail about what I mean by cartels, let me just review a little bit of a history of socialist revolutions in the world. This isn't an exhaustive list, right? It doesn't include Mongolia, where we are, but what it does is it illustrates something, because this is the substrates. I said substrates. That's the thing that something will grow out of. So Russia had a communist revolution that grew out of the economic distress caused by World War I. Germany, and I would call them a socialist revolution, this grew out of the post-World War, the interwar period of distress, the war guilt clause. China, there's a lot of literature about the Qing dynasty and their abuses and the desperation that people had, and then of course colonial pressure. They weren't colonized, but they had so many colonial pressures like the British and various wars. Vietnam, and this can also talk about Cambodia and Laos, right? They were suffering terrible abuses at the hands of French colonialists. Korea suffered terribly by under Japanese imperialism. And Cuba suffered under US imperialism and then a terrible dictatorship. And so we've had some somewhat democratic revolutions also that happened at the ballot box, right? Chile, this may be the one semi-exception that you didn't have the kind of horrible conditions that you had for these previous revolutions, but what you had was really deep-seated and bona fide grievances about land distribution post-colonialism. And then you had issues having to do with natural resource extraction. And then interestingly in Chile, what you had was a plurality election. You had a flaw in the electoral system that allowed somebody hated by the majority of the population to still assume office. In Venezuela, you had an economy that had been previously gutted in favor of being a petrol state, and you had oil price issues that led to problems, desperation, and dissatisfaction that allowed a demagogue to rise. What I think we can conclude from the record is that happy and hopeful people who are living in a well-managed, prosperous place don't take the Marxist bait. They don't bite because they're happy, hopeful, and well-fed. People become susceptible to these terrible, terrible ideas when they're suffering, when they feel like things are unfair, when it feels like profits are the unpaid wages of the working class. It may not be true, but when it feels like that, you're susceptible. You, all of a sudden, will think that the arguments being made by leftists and Marxists are correct. And so that brings us to the current state of capitalism in most of the Western world. And it was coined by Vladimir Lenin as state monopoly capitalism. He called this one of the highest stages of capitalism, or late stage capitalism. And so he says that monopoly arose out of the concentration of production at very high stage, monopolist capitalist associations, cartels, syndicates, and trusts. We've seen the important part these play in present day economic life. And this he was writing in, as you can see, 1916. State monopoly capitalism is the state where big business rises, fuses with the state, as I think we see in many or most developed economies today. Large corporations control resources. They partner with the government in the form of regulation or in the form of various anti-competitive structures, in the form of tax subsidies. And what do? They engage in extractive practices. So here's a look at the economy of the United States, specific regard to inflation over the last 20 or so years. And you can see that in some areas of the economy, people are doing really well. The bottom part of it, the ones in blue, these are things that have gotten cheaper for your average consumer. And then in red, you can see things that have gotten more expensive for your average consumer. This is, in my opinion, the most important graph in political science today. And the reason is because we can see in red where all the pain is. And it's no coincidence that all of the socialist rhetoric centers around the areas of pain. Hospital services, college tuition, childcare, medical services. Nobody is talking about clothing and the price of clothing and the need for universal clothing. Clothing is a necessity, but nobody is talking about the need for nationalization of clothing. Not yet. Not yet. And hopefully they never will. Why? Because the industries represented in red are highly cartelized industries. They're subject to heavy regulation, subsidization, and they're subject to oligopoly market conditions. And this leads me to the central point of my talk today, which is that cartels are a cancer on capitalism. Let me give you an overview of what happens. And I'll just break it down from my industry, healthcare. The first thing is that somebody alleges a market failure. They might say, for example, that there's information asymmetry. People love to say that about doctors. I know more than my patient, and therefore there's information asymmetry, and therefore the government needs to write in like a white knight and save the patient from the exploitative practices of the doctor. Wonderful. So now that they've alleged a market failure, they will come in and solve it. In the case of my profession, they did it with a restrictive licensing regimen. And so what they did is limit the number of doctors. So now not only is there information asymmetry, but now I have scarcity on my side. The patient has to wait months to get an appointment. I can charge whatever I want. I don't have to give them good service. And little by little, market failures get alleged, regulations get constructed, and what happens is entry into the market gets restricted. When entry into the market gets restricted, you have oligopoly conditions. You have the beginnings of a cartel. And now you can see prices rising, and you can see consumers suffering. They suffer from bad service, they suffer from poorly available services, and they pay through the nose. Workers in the United States have had, as you saw in the previous graph, rising wages, but they haven't actually had rising take-home pay because their healthcare expenses have been rising faster than their wages. Another way of saying that is that your money as a worker, if you're from the United States, is going into my pocket as a doctor, and it's happening because of my privileged economic position due to economic regulation. The difference can't be understated. The market for shoes, the market for clothes, the market for cars is all a market that's relatively easy to enter. You know, you have to invest a certain amount of money to be able to make a car, but that's about it. You don't have to compete for a quota, for a limited number of licenses to make a car, or a limited number of licenses to make shoes. The level of regulation is substantially lower, and so what it means is that there's not really any pain. Shoes keep getting cheaper and cheaper. You can go buy a $10 pair of shoes, but it's almost impossible to get healthcare services that are affordable in the United States. And this is causing a lot of pain. There are other similar issues. For example, left-wing politicians love to cite Medicare as the example of a wonderful government program that helps people who are elderly access medical care. But if you look at the flow of money under Medicare, what you see is that working people are taxed, and those taxes end up in the pockets of guys like me or of giant corporations that run the hospitals, because hospitals have their own cartels. Pharmaceuticals have their own cartel. Even in pharmaceuticals that don't have patents on them, or so-called generic pharmaceuticals, there are still licenses required that can cost upwards of several $100 million to obtain. So this means, for example, there's a drug in the United States called Daraprim that costs $750 US a pill. That same drug costs 5 cents a pill in the United Kingdom. It's the regulatory structure that's extracting money from the people. So when these companies make huge profits, how does that look to your average person who doesn't understand economics? It looks like the profits are stolen from the people. And in this case, they're right. But they're not right because there's something wrong with profit. They're not right because there's something wrong with capitalism. They're right because they're suffering under a condition of regulated capitalism that has created cartels. Because the capitalism that we practice in the West today has cancer. It's very sick. And we have to fix this problem if we're going to save capitalism. I cannot fight in the United States for healthcare freedom if I defend the status quo. The status quo is horrible. There's tremendous demand for socialized medicine. And it goes on and on for every other industry out there that's subject to heavy regulation. But what I can do... Oh, sure. But what I can do is I can advocate for free, open, and competitive markets. And when I advocate for free, open, and competitive markets, what I can do is I can tell people, listen, I'm going to give you the power as the consumer. I'm going to give you low-priced goods and services that are high quality. Every single year, the services you buy are going to get cheaper and better. Just like phones, just like shoes, just like cars. And if I do this, I have a potentially winning argument. There is no holding the line. I cannot possibly, none of us, in any of whatever country you're from, when you see people suffering from an extractive, mixed economy system, you will never be successful if you tell people, we have to hold the line here and just endure the kind of abuses that these business cartels are providing. People don't want to hear that. And free market advocates have often made this mistake. And when you make that mistake, you are basically conceding defeat to the left. So I want to tell you what I think are the most important political priorities in the United States. And these are really broadly applicable. Whatever country you're from, you should probably be able to see some corollaries in your country. So occupational licensure reform gives economic opportunity to more people because it lowers the barrier of entry into professions, but it also lowers the cost of services to the end consumer, meaning that people's quality of lives rise in general. And it directly attacks the kind of accumulation of wealth at the very top of the political structure that we're seeing. Free market healthcare reform, that's what I'm all about. It's what I spend my days promoting. And we can reduce the prices and increase the quality, and we can alleviate the suffering. When we alleviate the suffering, we're taking the wind out of Bernie Sanders' sails. Bernie Sanders cannot sell his scam to happy, hopeful, well-fed people. He can only sell his scam to people who are suffering. Education reform, people graduating with worthless college degrees, with tons of debt. And this is because of runaway subsidies. We can end government subsidization of education, and as a result, see college tuition drop dramatically, and see people going to college and getting degrees that have economic value, rather than getting degrees in things like gender studies or poetry that don't have any economic value, that just create somebody with high levels of debt who has a miserable economic life and who is definitely going to vote for leftists because they're unhappy. Criminal justice reform. Right now in the United States, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are cut off from all the best economic opportunities because they have a stupid criminal conviction. It creates an underclass. And do you think they're the only ones who become more susceptible to Marxist bait? Absolutely not. If you see your neighbors, people you care about, your loved ones, who are shut out from all the best jobs, it's maddening. And it's maddening, and you say, hey, capitalism's not working for a lot of people. But we know that this horrible criminal justice system is creating a source of very cheap labor. It's creating a lot of people who are suffering because they're shut out from opportunity. By having criminal justice reform, we can build a more inclusive economy and as a result, have more happy people who aren't subject to the bait. And finally, I would say we need electoral reform because if somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders should get elected, they're going to do it just like how Donald Trump won the Republican primaries. They're going to do it with a plurality, not the majority. You know, if you have 30 or 40% of the population extremely unhappy, they may be able to mobilize. That's why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is in Congress. It's not because her ideas are wildly popular right now, it's because they're wildly popular among a small subset of very misguided Democratic primary voters. This is how Salvador Allende became president of Chile and started a giant crisis. This is a very important aspect to protecting ourselves. We need to work on reforming the electoral system. I would finally say, though, that we are making some tremendous strides in busting cartels in the United States. And this is really a phenomenon that's been happening over the last 10 years. Uber entered the market almost all over the world and with a stroke of a pen busted the taxi cartels that had been abusing consumers, charging too much and delivering poor service. And that had nothing to do with the government. In fact, the Uber revolution, as I like to call it, was a revolution that happened over the objections of governments all over the world. And it was done by lawbreakers who said, we're going to do business despite the fact that it's illegal. It was a glorious revolution. It was an amazing thing. Airbnb is doing the same thing to hotels. And the list goes on. In medicine, we are working very hard to have a similar revolution where we sidestep politics and bust the cartels. And one way we're doing this is with what we're calling as the direct primary care movement, where we're cutting out third-party payer insurance companies and actually turning doctors into entrepreneurs whose goal is to give good service to their customers, to their patients. And it's having a great effect. There's a lot more that we can do. One of my big missions in life is to teach people in the United States how to opt out of the compromised healthcare system we have today and save money and take control of their care and get better healthcare for a lower price and have absolute control over their own decisions. And this involves things like medical tourism, direct primary care, the smart use of telemedicine. And when we do this, what we can expect is that we're going to take the power away from the politicians and put it back in the hands of the patients. And we're going to take the wind out of the sails of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. When we take the wind out of the sails, they stop being a threat to us. And then we can start to see return of greater economic growth. We can see capitalism and a wonderful engine of economic growth continue and speed up so that we can enjoy even more new and amazing things. It's my hope that in 20 years, the world is 100 times better than it is today, and it will be better in ways that I can't even imagine, thanks to capitalism. But that's only going to be the case if we're able to successfully create conditions of open and competitive markets in these basic parts of our economy so that we can relieve the pain that our patients are feeling. I want to make you guys a quick offer. I have a free guide that anybody from the United States will find it useful, but this is how to save thousands of dollars on your prescriptions. It's a very easy process, but if you are somebody who pays cash or wants to be paying cash and getting away from the government welfare benefits, this is your guide on how to do that. And you can go to drvarner.com/Mongolia and sign up, and I'll send you that for free. And so I think that one of the most important things we can do is use our power as consumers to reject cartelized industry and instead choose free market alternatives. You know, we brought down the taxi cartels. The hotel cartels are suffering, although they've still got a little bit of life in them. And I think we can bring down the medical cartels as well, or at the very least build a large base of cash-paying patients, which results in the political force necessary to further expand health freedom. We're not going to save capitalism in the United States or anywhere else in the world if we just try to hold the line at the status quo. We have to fight positively for freedom and for open and competitive markets, not markets that are controlled. Controlled markets with heavy regulation is just another way of saying a cartel that exploits consumers. So thank you.
Thank you for a really excellent talk. I just want to make a couple of points that I'm sure you agree with me on. In a pure, unfettered, free economy, as a fair marketplace, cartels per se are not used for competition. So what you're basically getting as cartels that use the government to give them protection.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of free market economic research that really shows that a cartel is impossible under free market conditions, because cartel members will pursue their own self-interest, and that self-interest is contrary to the interest of the cartels. If you have 3 or 4 oil companies and they decide we're going to fix prices, they can only do that in conditions where they have the ability to use state violence to keep oil prices, to keep, for example, production levels limited. And it's the same thing with taxis, the same thing with anything. And so I would say that in the absence of government, monopoly or cartel conditions don't exist.
We're basically saying you have to have coercive cartels versus not coercive, just like coercive monopolies versus not coercive. The other point is, the American Medical Association was founded in 1848 with the mission of getting licensing of physicians in the United States, because that was a goal to create a cartel. And so, we were dual members at the time.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
One other thing I would add to your list of libertarian priorities.
Yes.
To me, it's that movement should be moving up on the list, actually, is ending the drug war, because that also factors into wages and criminal justice. Somebody gets a felony conviction for possession of marijuana, they can be barred for all sorts of employment opportunities in the future. So that should be
You're absolutely right. The drug war is a huge economic problem for the United States. And I would also just point out, it also supports socialist regimes. Nicolas Maduro would have long ago been hanging by his neck from the window of Miraflores Palace if it weren't for his financial support from the Cartel of the Suns. So, I mean, we could undermine them tomorrow with a free market proposal. It's only coercive and bad government proposals that keep devils like him in power.
Yeah, Kyle, one thing that libertarians have not done hardly at all is we need to go out and make movies like Dallas Buyers Club. And if if the Kochs had spent all that money instead of these think tanks, I think we would have made a difference. I mean, can we get into that direction where you start a movie studio, start a record company, start book publishing? The left has always done this.
Right.
And some people in the alt-right, like Vox Day, know it. I mean, Vox Day is starting a comic book company. But we just spend money on think tanks.
Well, you have a really, really good point. So for those who don't know, Dallas Buyers Club is a movie about HIV patients who were distributing their own HIV therapy before it was approved by the FDA. And some of these people ended up in jail. They ended up in jail for trying to save their lives and trying to save the lives of their loved ones. And it's one of the most shameful episodes of regulatory abuse in the history of the United States. And that movie made a huge difference. But you're absolutely right that we need to work much more strongly on cultural understanding of these kind of issues. Leftism in the United States got a huge boost from a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And it's still taught in schools today. And what people don't realize is that it's a work of fiction, of absolute fiction. It's a piece of leftist propaganda that's still shoved down the mouths of children in government indoctrination camps, which is what I tend to refer to as schools. But this is a real problem, and I'm glad to mention, though, that I have a large number of videos that are going to be coming out as soon as my book is done with the editing process. And so I'm very committed to taking this fight public and to advocating in every corner of the globe for free, open, and competitive markets, and to advance the correct capitalist narrative that we need freedom, not more central control.
Okay, Mr. Ken.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about a point in your book that I understand talks about the American Medical Association, how it shut down half of the medical schools, reduced the number, raised prices, actually made it so that people couldn't afford health care. People were actually much worse off, and it was targeted against women and blacks and Jews and people that were on the outside. and their role in lobbying still today.
Yeah, so there were about 5 schools of medical thought towards the turn of the century, between 1850 and about 1900. You had allopaths, which is what I am, an MD. You had osteopaths, for DOs, and then you had homeopaths, eclectics, herbalists, and some other things. And there was a concerted effort to drive everybody but allopaths out of practice. And this was opposed very strongly by a famous author named Mark Twain. And he went to the Senate of the state of New York as they were considering a nascent licensure law. And he said, just paraphrasing, but he said, I hear you talking about the safety of patients, but it seems to me like there's a little bit of self-interest behind all of this. And it's true, because what they did is create scarcity with licensing laws. And this is what my profession does. We talk about patient safety, but we think about our own pocketbooks. And so doctors complain about nurse practitioners exceeding their scope of practice, even though the evidence says that nurse practitioners do excellent work and have equal outcomes to doctors. Doctors still disparage them out of their own economic self-interest, but they make the dishonest argument that it's about patient safety. We call this a financial conflict of interest, and they continue to disparage nurse practitioners without ever acknowledging their own conflict of financial interest. So the Flexner report was a report issued, I want to say in 1911, that, it shut about half the medical schools in the United States. And you can read the medical journals at the time where they talk about how there are too many doctors and that our wages are too low and it's dishonorable for us. There was a type of medical practice at the time called lodge practice, where there were these friendly societies like Eagles and Elks. They were basically clubs. And these clubs would hire a doctor who would then take care of their members. And this was really cheap for the members. But these doctors were basically run out of practice or threatened if they didn't quit. So it was actually kind of an organized effort using licensure laws and using the state to restrict the supply of doctors and increase their wages. Fast forward to 1997, and the US Senate effectively capped the number of medical licenses in the United States by restricting the number of residency spots. They did it in kind of a two-step way. The first thing they did was, over 20 or 30 years, increase the requirements for different kinds of bureaucratic requirements for residencies, such that they were basically not viable to be done in the free market. And they were subsidized, and then they capped the number of subsidies while leaving the requirements in place. And the head of the American Medical Association in 1997 testified to Congress that there was an impending physician surplus and it would cause major problems for healthcare in the United States. And Congress needed to act to restrict the number of doctors. And now people in the United States are dying for lack of doctors. That's cartel behavior from, I think, the worst cartel in the United States, the white coat cartel. I'm ashamed that I'm a member, but I'm very, very dedicated to busting this cartel.